Hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today and appreciate the efforts of Dr. Ahmed Al-Rubai and others in the community who strive to bring together informative initiatives. We are very lucky to have people who care. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders of the land on which we meet today, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge and am grateful to the Gabrugal clan of the Darug Nation. I hope Australia will reconcile with its history and give the Indigenous people of this land the deserved and long-awaited justice. Media coverage plays a major role in the social cohesion in Australia. While social media is covered separately in this seminar, and my focus is primarily on mainstream media, however, as you may be aware, stories are intertwined with social media, some profoundly more than others, such as the recent story heavily covered in Australia and overseas, and that stirred up emotions and tensions considerably. That's the stabbing attack of Bishop Mari Emmanuel, prominent leader of the Assyrian Orthodox of Christ the Good Shepherd Church at Wakeley, considered a terrorist incident by police who alleged he was attacked with a knife by a 16-year-old boy during the live-streamed Monday service. The teenager was subsequently charged with a terrorism offence and remains in custody. Following the incident, hundreds of people rioted outside the church, with dozens of police officers injured and vehicles damaged. More arrests were made in what police have branded large-scale public order incident. The graphic video of the stabbing prompted Australia's E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, to challenge Elon Musk's X-Corp in court after abandoning legal action over his refusal to take down footage of the stabbing. She argues the removal notice was to prevent the extremely violent footage from going viral, potentially inciting further violence and inflicting more harm on the Australian community. Musk argued freedom of speech. The posts sparked a wave of death threats and online abuse. The E-Safety Commission approached police over fears for Ms. Inman-Grant's safety. Calming tensions, the bishop forgave his attacker and returned to his sermons broadcast on the church's Facebook and YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of social media followers. According to Peter Lowe, youth extremism expert and former director of counter-violent extremism for New South Wales Juvenile Justice, the youth has long-standing mental health concerns and a suspected cognitive disorder left him vulnerable to radicalization. Police are working to unravel who he was communicating with on his phone and in person in a joint counter-terrorism team because of what was described as unacceptable risk and threats to the public. As you can imagine, this stirred up a lot of community reaction, condemnation, and rejecting the violence and rejecting the negative portrayal of communities in the media, yet again. Assyrian community leader Peter Esho proposed a meeting with New South Wales government representatives, including the Premier Chris Minns, to discuss the aftermath of the assault and subsequent unrest. Mr. Esho said the Assyrian community rejects outright their negative portrayal by some in the mainstream media. The police response to the Wakely attack also sparked deep distress and anger in southwest Sydney's Muslim community, who condemned the attack. Community leaders were dismayed at language used by police and ASIO about the term. Leaders were dismayed that the term used was rigorously motivated extremism, which they say conflates Islam with terrorism. Dr. Jamal Rifi, who has worked with police to counter violent extremism, said to the ABC's 7:30 report, "What the boy did was inexcusable." He added, "We're not looking for him to be exonerated. We just want him to have a fair go as any other person in similar circumstances with undiagnosed mental illness." His response is consistent with responses over the years from Arabic, Muslim, and Middle Eastern communities complaining about the mainstream media's portrayal and its negative impact on social cohesion, with reactions to the developments such as, remember, September 11th, the Bali bombing, the wars in Syria, in Lebanon, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the war on Gaza. Stereotyping and racism in the media remained one of the challenging issues, as the Cronulla riots demonstrated, with huge impact on Australia and its reputation. We learn from both responsible and irresponsible media coverage of the Cronulla riots as tensions exploded in 2005, made worse by some shock jocks in one of Australia's darkest chapters, racism at its ugliest forms. The Australian Human Rights Commission acknowledges the importance of the media role and illustrates how possible breaches of the law can be avoided, highlighting the responsibilities that come with working within the Racial Hatred Act. Positive government policies play a key role in calming tensions, and I'll give you an example of the terrorist attack in Christchurch. For example, it sparked outrage, sending a clear message that hate speech is no longer a way to gain political power or advance political expediency. The former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, vowed to make accountable politicians and social media who inflame hate and racism. The media can play a key role in empowering communities to be informed, confident with their Australian identity in a vibrant democracy like it is here in Australia, with professionally treated content reflecting in practice journalistic codes of ethics and standards. It's not rocket science. Everything is there. All what they have to do is just implement the law. Examples of effective engagement is demonstrated by the impact of Media Excellence Awards, such as Multicultural and Indigenous Awards, showcasing and recognizing creativity in the media. This was particularly evident with coverage of sensitive, controversial issues, including the impact of events that challenged the youth and placed entire communities in Australia, time and time again, under pressure and scrutiny. What happened?
Just for a while. Yep.
Okay. Overcoming the pattern of negative media portrayal with culturally relevant positive media initiatives is one of my close to heart strategies. I focused during my career, reflected in the training of broadcast journalists, thousands of stories, current affairs programs, debates about the impact of global and domestic news that challenged and divided communities and created tensions with the wider Australian public. I found the most effective engagement, especially with the youth, is achieved with positive initiatives such as Youth Power program, giving the youth a voice to express themselves, bridging together communities. Youth Power competition showcased creative contributions from youth to encourage them to focus on their talents after the Cronulla riots rather than feeling victimized by stereotyping and racism. This, coupled with ongoing special programming, discussions with academics, community leaders, social workers, police, families, individuals, reflected relentless efforts to embrace the goodwill of communities eager to live in harmony. The roles of the mainstream media are highlighted in a round-table discussion report on media and violent extremism at the University of Technology in 2022 by the Centre of Media Transition. It raises some very interesting perspectives. It confirms media coverage of extremism and the government stance impact minority communities in Australia, especially Muslim communities, suggesting three values must be kept in mind: proportionality of the event, the context in which it happens, and the significance of the consequences for the public. Journalists needed to do their job better and more responsibly in terms of scrutinizing information and providing context in reportage. Mainstream media's approach to coverage of extremism and extremists was not consistent, as there may be a bias at play in the editorial process. It was also noted that there were more negative stories in news media about minority communities than that framed them in a positive light. Are you surprised? And that Muslim communities in Australia are still facing, until now, the fallout from the Cronulla riots and the way the conflict between the Muslim communities and other Australians was reported in mainstream media. And it suggests there's no consistency, no depth to the definitions and guidelines provided by the editorial policies of the news media organisations. As different organisations have their own policies and standards, such as the ABC, News Corp, the Australian, the Nine Entertainment Group, Metro Papers, the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Age. It is widely accepted within news media that resources are limited. This has repercussions on the ability of news journalists to undergo training in cultural sensitivity, diversity, inclusion, and ethics. There is a need to develop a commonality of ethical approaches and language communicated to the newsroom floor of each outlet, and the need for greater diversity within newsrooms to understand the cultural sensitivities within different communities, how to speak with them in order to arrive at more accurate reporting. We go forward by reflecting in our coverage compliance with the Australian media ethics, guidelines and laws. That's a recommendation, such as the standards of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, MEAA, the Australian Press Council, APC, and defined media guidance by the Australian Communication and Media Authority, ACMA. The codes of ethics provided by the Media MEAA guidelines on reporting hate speech and extremism, for example, advise against platforming hate speech for protection against inaccuracy and the negative impact on social cohesion, mistrust of both journalists and governments. These principles serve how to report violent extremism, which brings together the principles of various codes, as well as those enshrined in the state, territory, and federal racial anti-discrimination instruments. In November 2023, MEAA, that's the journalist union I referred to earlier, called for the protection of more than 100 journalists who signed an open letter, petition newsrooms to cover the developments in Israel and Palestine with integrity, transparency and rigor, and stating the disproportionate human suffering, this disproportionate suffering of Palestinian civilians population in Gaza should not be minimized. The petition outlined steps to improve the coverage with signatories from a diversity of media, including the ABC and the Guardian. MEAA states, journalists must be protected to stand up for the Journalist Code of Ethics. The support came in response to some media organization warning their staff not to sign the petition, as they would be unable to participate in any reporting or production related to the war, and reminding journalists to abstain from signing any petition that may bring into question the impartiality of the coverage. The letter was signed by many prominent journalists, such as our dear friend Jan Fran. Her father, Tony Francis, is here today. So she was quite active in trying to protect the integrity of journalism in Australia. And this letter that was signed was sent to newsrooms, and it calls on them to adhere to the truth over both sidism, what was described. The human suffering of Palestinian civilians should not be minimized, but included in the coverage. Apply as much professional skepticism when relying on uncorroborated Israeli government and military sources to shape coverage as is applied to Hamas. Give adequate coverage to credible allegations of war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, and not to avoid using the term Palestine where appropriate. Provide historical context when referring to October the 7th Hamas attack on Israel. Provide full and fair coverage to Australia's growing anti-war movement and the traumatizing impact on Arab, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Be transparent about journalists who have been on all expenses paid trips to Israel organized by pro-Israeli government groups, and trust Australian journalists of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and Jewish backgrounds to do their jobs. Diversity is an asset. And Okay, journalists paid an unprecedented price according to International Federation of Journalists. At least 124 journalists killed during this conflict so far, with 117 Palestinian, 4 Israelis, 3 Lebanese. I'd like to leave you finally, as I've run out of time, with some very important principles from the Australian Press Council standards, which focus on accuracy, clarity, fairness, balance, privacy, integrity, and transparency, and avoidance of harm. And everyone can access the site of ACMA, and here's more information about it. Finally, I'd like to thank you for listening and just say that even though truth is hard to find, balance and fairness are not. So dare to go beyond the spin. Thank you.